37,000 feet above the Atlantic Ocean, watching the CEO who'd built his empire on my strategies lean forward with that familiar predatory smile, I knew my career at Morrison Global was about to end. What he didn't know was that I held the key to the $3.7 billion acquisition we were literally flying to close, and without me, his company would be worthless within 48 hours. The turbulence hit just as Richard Morrison's voice cut through the cabin's white noise like a blade through silk. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I was reviewing the final contract amendments for the Zenith Industries acquisition, when his words made my blood run cold, in a way that had nothing to do with the aircraft's altitude. Sarah, we need to discuss your future with the company. I looked up from my laptop, my fingers still poised over the keyboard, where I'd been fine-tuning the legal language that would secure Morrison Global's biggest deal in its 30-year history. The private jet's cabin felt smaller suddenly, the cream leather seats and polished mahogany table between us, seeming to close in like a trap. Richard sat across from me, his silver hair perfectly styled despite the 6-hour flight, his navy suit unwrinkled and his expression carefully neutral in that way that meant he was about to destroy someone's life. I'd seen that look before. I'd watched him use it on competitors, on board members who questioned his decisions, on employees who'd outlived their usefulness. I just never thought I'd be on the receiving end of it. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here we were, racing toward London at 560 miles per hour to finalize the deal that would make Morrison Global the largest logistics conglomerate in North America. And he was about to fire the woman who'd orchestrated every detail of it. The woman who'd spent 18 months cultivating relationships with Zenith's board members, who'd identified the acquisition target in the first place, who'd structured the financing that made the seemingly impossible purchase feasible. Richard's chief financial officer, David Chen, shifted uncomfortably in the seat beside him. David had been with the company for 12 years, long enough to know when Richard was about to make one of his calculated moves. The kind that looked ruthless to outsiders, but made perfect sense to shareholders. His eyes avoided mine, focusing instead on the contract documents spread across the table between us. The third member of our travel party, legal counsel Jennifer Walsh, at least had the courtesy to look uncomfortable. She'd been reviewing merger documents for the past hour, but now her attention was fixed on Richard with the kind of intensity that suggested she knew exactly what was coming. Jennifer and I had worked closely together over the past year and a half. She knew better than anyone how integral I'd been to making this deal happen. Future, I repeated, setting my laptop aside with deliberate calm. I'd learned long ago never to show weakness in Richard's presence. He was the kind of man who viewed emotion as blood in the water, an invitation to circle closer and strike harder. Is there a problem with my performance? Richard leaned back in his seat, his fingers steepled in front of him in a gesture I'd seen him use countless times during board meetings. It was his power pose, the physical manifestation of his belief that he held all the cards in any given situation. No problem at all, Sarah. Your work on the Zenith acquisition has been exemplary. Truly exceptional. The praise felt like a slap. When Richard Morrison started a conversation with compliments, it meant he was about to deliver devastating news. I'd watched him use the same technique when he'd fired the head of European operations 6 months earlier, praising the man's decade of service right before announcing his immediate termination. But, Richard continued, and there it was, the word that would change everything. The board has decided to restructure the mergers and acquisitions division. We're bringing in some fresh perspectives, some new strategic thinking. Fresh perspectives. New strategic thinking. Corporate euphemisms for younger and cheaper. I'd heard the whispers in the office, seen the way Richard's eyes lit up when discussing the rising stars from Wharton and Harvard, who were willing to work 80-hour weeks for half my salary. I'd been naive enough to think my track record would protect me, naive enough to believe that results mattered more than age demographics and cost-cutting measures. The plane hit another patch of turbulence, and my stomach dropped for reasons that had nothing to do with the aircraft's movement. Restructure, I said carefully. What exactly does that mean for my position? David Chen cleared his throat, finally looking up from his documents. "The restructure will be effective immediately upon our return to New York," he said, his voice barely audible over the jet's engines. "We'll be transitioning your responsibilities to Marcus Williams." Marcus Williams. 28 years old, MBA from Columbia, 3 years of experience and the strategic thinking of a first-year analyst. I'd been the one to hire him, actually. I'd seen potential in his aggressive approach to deal-making, his willingness to take risks that more experienced professionals might shy away from. I'd mentored him, taught him the intricacies of international acquisitions, shared the relationship-building techniques I'd developed over 15 years in the industry. And now he was taking my job. The betrayal cut deeper than the termination itself. It wasn't just that Richard was firing me, it was that he was handing my life's work to someone I'd trained. Someone who existed in the industry because of opportunities I'd created for him. The irony was so sharp, it was almost funny. Almost. "Marcus is talented," I said, keeping my voice level despite the rage building in my chest. "But he's never handled anything close to the scale of Zenith. This is a $3.7 billion acquisition with regulatory approval processes in 6 different countries. The financing alone involves 12 international banks and requires ongoing relationship management that takes years to develop." Richard waved his hand dismissively, as if my concerns were nothing more than the anxious ramblings of an employee trying to save her job. "Marcus is a quick learner," he said, "and he'll have David and Jennifer to guide him through any complications." I looked at David, whose expression had grown increasingly uncomfortable as the conversation progressed. David knew the numbers better than anyone. He understood that the Zenith deal wasn't just complex. It was a house of cards that required precise coordination and deep institutional knowledge to prevent it from collapsing. Marcus Williams might be talented, but he didn't have the relationships I'd built with Zenith's board members. He didn't understand the cultural nuances that had made the European components of the deal possible. He didn't know about the personal guarantees I'd negotiated with 3 different investment banks to secure favorable financing terms. What Marcus had was youth, ambition, and a willingness to work for significantly less money than Morrison Global was paying me. In Richard's calculation, that was apparently enough. "The financial terms of your departure will be generous," Richard continued, as if offering a substantial severance package would somehow soften the blow of professional assassination. 6 months' salary, full health benefits through the end of the year, and will provide positive references for any future opportunities. 6 months' salary. After 15 years of building his company's reputation in international markets, after generating over $2 billion in successful acquisitions, after sacrificing marriages and friendships and countless personal opportunities in service of Morrison Global's growth, he was offering me 6 months' salary as compensation for my career. "I appreciate the offer," I said, though appreciation was the furthest thing from what I was feeling. "When exactly were you planning to announce this restructuring?" Richard glanced at his watch, a Patek Philippe that had cost more than most people's annual salaries. "We'll make the announcement Monday morning. That gives you the weekend to transition your files and brief Marcus on any outstanding issues with the Zenith acquisition. Monday morning. 3 days from now. 3 days to watch someone else take credit for 18 months of work. To see Marcus Williams step into meetings with clients who knew my name and trusted my judgment. To witness the systematic erasure of my contributions to the company I'd helped build. But Richard had made a critical miscalculation, one that would become apparent soon enough. The Zenith Industries acquisition wasn't just another deal. It was my deal, structured around relationships and agreements that existed because of my personal credibility with key stakeholders. The financing arrangements I'd negotiated weren't just corporate contracts. They were personal guarantees based on years of trust building with international banking partners who'd never heard of Marcus Williams. More importantly, the acquisition was built on a foundation that Richard didn't fully understand, despite the dozens of briefings I'd given him over the past year. Zenith Industries wasn't just a logistics company, it was a family business, founded by Sir James Caldwell 35 years earlier and still controlled by family trust. The Caldwells had agreed to sell to Morrison Global not because of our offer, which wasn't the highest they'd received, but because of personal relationships I'd cultivated with James's daughter Elizabeth, who served as the trust's primary decision-maker. Elizabeth Caldwell and I had spent months building mutual respect and trust. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She'd invited me to her home in the Cotswolds, introduced me to her children, shared stories about her father's vision for the company he'd built from nothing. The acquisition wasn't just a business transaction for the Caldwells. It was the transfer of a legacy, and Elizabeth had chosen Morrison Global specifically because she trusted me to honor that legacy. Marcus Williams had never met Elizabeth Caldwell. He didn't know about her concerns regarding employee retention, her insistence on maintaining Zenith's company culture, her requirement that key management positions remain unchanged for at least 2 years post-acquisition. These weren't just preferences. They were deal breakers, conditions that Elizabeth had made clear would void the agreement if not honored. Richard thought he could simply plug Marcus into my role and continue business as usual. He had no idea that the Zenith acquisition was held together by personal relationships that couldn't be transferred, like stock options or corporate titles. He didn't understand that trust, once broken, couldn't be rebuilt with PowerPoint presentations and quarterly earnings projections. The plane began its descent into Heathrow, and I felt the familiar pressure change in my ears. Outside the small window, London's skyline came into view, gray and imposing under the late afternoon clouds. In 6 hours, we'd be sitting across from Elizabeth Caldwell and her legal team, finalizing the documents that would make Morrison Global a dominant force in international logistics. It would be my last official act as the company's head of mergers and acquisitions. Or so Richard thought. "Sarah," Richard said, breaking into my thoughts, "I want you to know that this decision wasn't made lightly. Your contributions to Morrison Global have been significant, and we genuinely appreciate everything you've done for the company." The words rang hollow, corporate speak designed to assuage his conscience rather than acknowledge the magnitude of what he was taking from me. I nodded politely, understanding that any response I gave would be meaningless. Richard had made his decision, probably weeks or even months ago. This conversation was just a formality, a box to check before moving forward with his cost-cutting initiatives. "I understand," I said, closing my laptop and preparing for landing. "I assume you'll want me to handle the Zenith closing tomorrow as originally planned?" "Absolutely," Richard replied. "It's important that we maintain continuity through the transition. Elizabeth Caldwell knows you, trusts you. Having you manage the closing will ensure everything goes smoothly." The irony was so thick it was suffocating. Richard wanted me to finalize the deal that would secure his company's future, then quietly disappear so Marcus Williams could take credit for the success. He wanted me to hand over the relationships I'd built, the trust I'd earned, the strategic insights I'd developed, all while pretending that my termination was nothing more than a routine business decision. But Richard had underestimated one crucial factor in his carefully planned transition. He assumed that loyalty was something that could be transferred along with files and contact lists. He believed that the personal relationships driving the Zenith acquisition were actually corporate relationships, assets that belonged to Morrison Global rather than to the individual who'd created them. He was about to learn otherwise. The plane touched down at Heathrow with barely a bump, Richard's pilot executing another perfect landing despite the challenging weather conditions. As we taxied toward the private aviation terminal, I watched the familiar sights of London pass by the window. This was my 15th trip to the city in the past 18 months, each visit building toward the moment when Zenith Industries would become part of Morrison Global's portfolio. Tomorrow, in a conference room at Zenith's headquarters in Canary Wharf, Elizabeth Caldwell would sign the documents that transferred her family's company to Richard Morrison. She'd chosen Morrison Global over 6 other potential buyers, including 2 private equity firms that had offered significantly more money. She'd made that choice because she trusted me to ensure that her father's legacy would be preserved, that Zenith's employees would be protected, that the company's culture would remain intact. Elizabeth didn't know that I'd just been fired. She didn't know that Marcus Williams, a complete stranger, would be taking over the relationship she'd spent months building with me. She didn't know that Richard Morrison viewed her father's legacy as nothing more than an asset to be optimized for maximum shareholder value. But she was about to find out. As we gathered our belongings and prepared to disembark, Richard's phone buzzed with an incoming message. He glanced at the screen, his expression brightening with satisfaction. "Perfect," he said. "Marcus just confirmed he's prepared to step into the acquisition role immediately. He'll be flying in Sunday evening to shadow the transition." Shadow the transition. The phrase made my skin crawl. Marcus Williams would be observing as I performed my final duties, learning the intricacies of a deal he'd had no hand in creating, preparing to take credit for work that had consumed the better part of 2 years of my life. He'd sit in meetings with clients who knew my name and trusted my judgment, positioning himself as their new primary contact while I faded into corporate history. The airport shuttle was waiting when we stepped off the plane, a sleek black Mercedes that would take us to the Langham Hotel, where Morrison Global maintained a corporate suite for international business travel. The drive through London's familiar streets gave me time to process what had just happened, to move beyond the initial shock and anger, and begin thinking strategically about my options. I could fight the termination, of course, file a wrongful dismissal lawsuit, claim age discrimination, argue that my firing violated the terms of my employment contract. I could make Richard's life complicated, force him to defend his decision in court, potentially secure a larger severance package through legal pressure. But litigation would take years, and the legal fees would be substantial. More importantly, it would tie me to Morrison Global's corporate drama at a time when I needed to be thinking about my future. At 43, I was too young to retire, and too experienced to start over at the bottom of another company's hierarchy. I needed to leverage my reputation and relationships into a new opportunity, not waste time fighting old battles with former employers. There was another option, though. One that Richard Morrison hadn't considered when he'd made his calculated decision to replace me with a cheaper alternative. The Zenith Industries acquisition wasn't just my career's crowning achievement, it was also my ticket to independence if I played the situation correctly. Elizabeth Caldwell had chosen Morrison Global because she trusted me. The financing for the acquisition was structured around banking relationships I developed over 15 years in the industry. The regulatory approvals in 6 different countries had been secured through contacts and influence that existed in my network, not Morrison Global's corporate database. Richard thought he could simply transfer these assets to Marcus Williams, like updating signatory authority on a bank account. He had no idea that trust and influence aren't corporate properties. They're personal currencies that can't be redistributed through executive memos and organizational charts. Tomorrow's closing meeting would be my opportunity to demonstrate the difference between corporate relationships and personal ones. Elizabeth Caldwell was about to learn that the woman she'd chosen to entrust with her family's legacy had just been discarded by the company she'd selected as Zenith's new owner. The international banking partners who'd structured favorable financing terms were about to discover that their primary contact at Morrison Global had been terminated 3 days before the deal's completion. The information asymmetry that Richard had created by firing me without informing Zenith or the financing partners was about to become his problem, not mine. In less than 24 hours, he'd be sitting across from Elizabeth Caldwell, trying to explain why the person she'd spent 18 months working with was no longer part of his organization. He'd be fielding calls from confused bank executives who'd structured billion-dollar financing arrangements based on relationships with someone who was no longer employed by Morrison Global. The hotel suite was exactly as I'd left it 2 weeks earlier, during my previous trip to finalize the acquisition timeline. Morrison Global maintained the penthouse accommodation year-round, a luxurious base of operations for the company's European business activities. The living room offered panoramic views of London's skyline, and the bedroom was stocked with amenities that made extended international travel bearable. Richard had reserved an additional suite for tomorrow night's celebration dinner, where he'd planned to toast the successful completion of the Zenith acquisition. He'd invited a select group of Morrison Global executives, including Marcus Williams, who'd flown in specifically to begin taking over my responsibilities. The dinner was intended to be a victory celebration, a public acknowledgement of the deal that would define Richard's legacy as chief executive officer. Instead, it was going to be a wake for his company's credibility in international markets. I spent the evening reviewing my personal files, separating corporate documents from the relationship maps and contact networks I'd built over 15 years in the industry. The distinction was important, both legally and strategically. Morrison Global owned the corporate intellectual property, but the personal relationships, The trust I'd earned with international partners, the reputation I'd built in global markets, those belonged to me. My phone rang at 9:30, Elizabeth Caldwell's name appearing on the screen. Our conversation was brief but telling. She wanted to confirm tomorrow's meeting schedule and express her excitement about finally completing the acquisition process. She also mentioned her surprise at learning, through a casual conversation with one of Zenith's board members, that someone named Marcus Williams had been asking questions about the deal structure. "Who is Marcus Williams?" she asked, her voice carrying the polite concern of someone who'd just discovered an unexpected variable in a carefully planned process. I chose my words carefully. "Marcus is Richard's protégé," I said. "He's been observing the acquisition process as part of his professional development." It wasn't technically a lie, but it wasn't the complete truth either. Elizabeth didn't need to know about my termination until tomorrow, when the information would have maximum impact on her decision-making process. She'd spent 18 months building a relationship with me, trusting that I'd ensure her family's company would be treated with respect and care. Learning that Morrison Global had fired me 3 days before the closing would raise serious questions about the company's commitment to the agreements we'd negotiated. Tomorrow's meeting was scheduled for 10 o'clock at Zenith's headquarters in Canary Wharf. Elizabeth would be there, along with her legal team and the family trust's financial advisors. Richard would arrive with David Chen, Jennifer Walsh, and Marcus Williams, expecting to execute the final documents and celebrate Morrison Global's largest acquisition. Instead, he was going to discover that corporate relationships aren't as transferable as he'd assumed. Trust, once broken, doesn't heal quickly in international business circles. And the woman he'd fired, 37,000 feet above the Atlantic Ocean, held more cards than he'd ever realized. I set my alarm for 6 o'clock and tried to get some sleep, knowing that tomorrow would be the most important day of my career. Not because I was completing a $3.7 billion acquisition, but because I was about to demonstrate the difference between being employed by a company and being indispensable to its success. Richard Morrison thought he could replace me with a cheaper alternative. Tomorrow he'd learn that some things can't be purchased, and some relationships can't be transferred. He'd discover that firing the architect of your success, especially 3 days before that success is supposed to be realized, can have consequences that extend far beyond severance packages and transition timelines. The London skyline glittered outside my hotel window as I finally drifted off to sleep, unaware that 48 hours later, Morrison Global's stock would be in freefall, and Richard Morrison would be desperately calling my phone, begging me to save the company I'd once considered my professional home. The London morning arrived with the kind of persistent drizzle that seemed designed to match my mood. I stood at the window of my hotel suite, watching the city wake up beneath gray clouds, and felt something I hadn't experienced in 15 years of high-stakes deal-making: complete uncertainty about my professional future. In 6 hours, I would walk into Zenith Industries' headquarters to finalize the acquisition that would cement Richard Morrison's legacy, while simultaneously ending my own career with his company. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent the better part of 2 years orchestrating every detail of this transaction, from the initial market research that identified Zenith as an acquisition target to the complex financing arrangements that made the purchase feasible. Now I was about to hand over the culmination of that work to someone who'd had no involvement in creating it, while pretending that my imminent departure was simply a routine corporate restructuring. My phone had been buzzing since 6 in the morning with messages from various team members back in New York, all unaware of the bombshell Richard had dropped during our flight. The irony of their continued reliance on my expertise, even as I'd been dismissed from the company, wasn't lost on me. They needed clarification on contract language, guidance on regulatory compliance issues, insights into the cultural considerations that would affect post-acquisition integration. Under normal circumstances, I would have spent the morning fielding these questions, ensuring that every detail was perfect before walking into the closing meeting. Today, however, I found myself in the strange position of managing the final stages of a deal I would receive no credit for completing, while training my replacement to take over relationships he'd had no hand in building. Marcus Williams had arrived at Heathrow on the red-eye flight from JFK, and according to the text message Richard had sent me at 7:30, he was already at Morrison Global's London office, reviewing files and preparing for his introduction to Elizabeth Caldwell. The thought of this 28-year-old stranger attempting to manage relationships I'd spent 18 months cultivating made my stomach turn, but it also clarified something important about my situation. Richard Morrison had made a fundamental miscalculation when he decided to fire me 3 days before the Zenith closing. He'd assumed that corporate relationships were transferable, that trust could be redistributed through organizational charts and introductory meetings. He'd failed to understand that the Zenith acquisition wasn't just a business transaction. It was the result of personal connections, individual credibility, and relationship capital that existed independently of Morrison Global's corporate structure. Elizabeth Caldwell had chosen our company over 6 other potential buyers, including 2 private equity firms that had offered significantly more money because she trusted me personally. The favorable financing terms we'd secured from international banking partners weren't based on Morrison Global's credit rating. They were the result of personal relationships I'd built over 15 years in the industry. The regulatory approvals we'd obtained in 6 different countries weren't just corporate achievements. They were the outcome of influence networks that existed in my professional sphere, not in Morrison Global's database. Richard thought he could simply plug Marcus Williams into my role and continue business as usual. He had no understanding of the personal guarantees I'd made to secure key aspects of the deal, the informal agreements that existed between Elizabeth and me regarding post-acquisition management decisions, the cultural sensitivities that had been crucial to gaining the Caldwell family's trust. The morning briefing session was scheduled for 9 o'clock at Morrison Global's London office, 30 minutes before we'd travel to Zenith's headquarters for the actual closing. Richard wanted to review the final documents with the entire team, ensure everyone understood their roles in the signing ceremony, and formally introduce Marcus as the new point person for the Zenith relationship. I arrived at the office 15 minutes early, using my key card to access the 32nd floor conference room where Morrison Global conducted its European operations. The space was familiar from dozens of previous visits, with its panoramic views of London's financial district and its collection of expensive artwork that Richard had purchased to impress international clients. David Chen was already there, reviewing financial projections on his laptop and looking increasingly nervous as the closing time approached. David understood the numbers better than anyone, and he knew that the Zenith acquisition represented more than just Morrison Global's largest deal. It was the transaction that would define the company's position in international markets for the next decade. Jennifer Walsh arrived a few minutes later, carrying a leather portfolio containing the final contract documents. Jennifer and I had worked closely together throughout the acquisition process, and she understood better than anyone how complex the legal structures underlying the deal had become. The Zenith transaction involved regulatory compliance in 6 different countries, financing arrangements with 12 international banks, and family trust structures that required specialized expertise to navigate successfully. Marcus Williams made his entrance at exactly 9 o'clock, accompanied by Richard Morrison, who looked refreshed and confident despite the long flight from New York. Marcus appeared younger than his 28 years, dressed in an expensive suit that couldn't quite disguise his inexperience with international deal-making. His handshake was firm, his smile confident, but I could see the nervousness in his eyes as he attempted to project authority in a situation that was clearly beyond his comfort zone. "Sarah," Richard said, his voice carrying the false warmth he reserved for situations where he needed something from someone he'd just betrayed. "I'd like you to bring Marcus up to speed on any last-minute details he should be aware of before we meet with Elizabeth." The request was surreal in its casual assumption that I would simply cooperate with my own replacement, that professional courtesy would override personal dignity in service of Morrison Global's corporate interests. Richard wanted me to brief Marcus on the intricacies of a deal I'd spent 18 months developing, share the relationship insights that had made the acquisition possible, and essentially train my successor to take credit for my work. I looked at Marcus, taking in his eager expression and obvious anxiety about managing a transaction far beyond his experience level. Under different circumstances, I might have felt sorry for him. He was being thrown into a situation that would challenge even experienced professionals, expected to manage relationships he'd never developed, and navigate cultural complexities he didn't understand. But sympathy was a luxury I couldn't afford at the moment. Marcus Williams had accepted a position that rightfully belonged to me, agreed to take credit for work he'd had no hand in creating, and positioned himself to benefit from relationships I'd built through years of careful cultivation. Whether he understood the ethical implications of his situation was irrelevant. The fact remained that he was complicit in my professional destruction. Of course, I said, maintaining the polite professionalism that had served me throughout my career. Marcus, the most important thing to understand about Elizabeth Caldwell is that she views this transaction as more than just a business deal. Zenith Industries was founded by her father, and she's incredibly protective of the company culture and employee relationships that define the organization. Marcus nodded eagerly, pulling out a notebook to record my insights. I continued, sharing surface-level information that would be useful for the closing meeting, while carefully omitting the deeper relationship dynamics that actually drove Elizabeth's decision-making process. I told him about her preferences for formal business protocols, her attention to detail regarding contract language, her insistence on maintaining Zenith's operational independence post-acquisition. What I didn't tell him was that Elizabeth had specifically asked me, during a private conversation 6 months earlier, to personally guarantee that Morrison Global wouldn't implement the kind of aggressive cost-cutting measures that typically followed corporate acquisitions. I didn't mention that she'd made her final decision to accept our offer only after I'd assured her that I would remain personally involved in managing the post-acquisition transition process. Most importantly, I didn't share that Elizabeth Caldwell had invited me to dinner at her family estate the previous month, where she'd expressed serious reservations about Richard Morrison's reputation for prioritizing shareholder value over employee welfare. She'd chosen Morrison Global despite her concerns about Richard, because she trusted me to protect Zenith's interests during the integration process. The briefing session continued for 20 minutes, with Richard occasionally interjecting questions and David reviewing financial details that Marcus would need to understand. Jennifer walked through the legal structure of the transaction, explaining the regulatory requirements that had shaped our approach to the acquisition. Throughout the session, I found myself observing Marcus with growing fascination. He was clearly intelligent, asking thoughtful questions about aspects of the deal that demonstrated his analytical capabilities. But intelligence wasn't the same as experience, and experience wasn't the same as relationship capital. Marcus could understand the mechanics of the Zenith acquisition, but he couldn't replicate the trust and personal connection that had made the transaction possible. At 9:30, we gathered our materials and prepared to travel to Zenith's headquarters. The closing meeting was scheduled for 10 o'clock, with Elizabeth Caldwell, her legal team, and the family trust's financial advisors. It would be a formal ceremony, with signatures on dozens of documents, wire transfers totaling $3.7 billion, and handshakes that would transfer control of a 35-year-old company from its founding family to Morrison Global's corporate structure. The car ride through London's morning traffic gave me time to reflect on the strange position I found myself in. In less than an hour, I would be completing the most significant transaction of my career while simultaneously participating in my own professional execution. I would shake Elizabeth Caldwell's hand, accept her gratitude for facilitating the deal, and pretend that everything was proceeding according to plan. Richard sat beside me in the back seat, reviewing talking points on his phone and occasionally glancing out the window at London's familiar landmarks. He seemed completely at ease, confident that the morning's proceedings would unfold exactly as he'd planned. The successful completion of the Zenith acquisition would cement his reputation as a visionary leader, while the transition to Marcus Williams would demonstrate his ability to develop young talent and manage costs effectively. Marcus and David rode in the car behind us, with Jennifer following in a third vehicle that contained the legal documents and wire transfer instructions. The convoy of black sedans made its way through London's financial district, past the gleaming towers that house the world's most powerful banking institutions, toward the Canary Wharf complex, where Zenith Industries had relocated its headquarters 5 years earlier. As we approached Zenith's building, I felt a familiar mixture of excitement and nervousness that always preceded major deal closings. Despite everything that had happened in the past 24 hours, despite my anger at Richard and my concerns about the future, I still felt the professional satisfaction that came with completing complex transactions. The Zenith acquisition represented thousands of hours of work, months of relationship building, and the successful navigation of regulatory challenges that had defeated other potential buyers. Elizabeth Caldwell was waiting in the lobby when we arrived, surrounded by her legal team and looking every inch the successful business executive she'd become since taking over leadership of her father's company. She was dressed in a navy suit that conveyed authority without sacrificing femininity. her graying hair styled in a way that suggested both professionalism and approachability. "Sarah," she said warmly, extending her hand as I approached, "it's wonderful to see you again. I have to admit I'm feeling rather emotional about today. 35 years of family ownership coming to an end, it's quite overwhelming." I shook her hand, acutely aware that this might be the last time we'd interact as business partners rather than former colleagues. Elizabeth had become more than just a client. Over the past 18 months, she'd become someone I genuinely respected and enjoyed working with. The thought of deceiving her about my situation at Morrison Global created an uncomfortable tightness in my chest. "Elizabeth, I'd like you to meet Richard Morrison, our Chief Executive Officer," I said, stepping aside to facilitate the introduction. Richard had coached me extensively on this moment, emphasizing the importance of positioning him as Morrison Global's visionary leader, while maintaining Elizabeth's comfort with the personal relationship she'd developed. Richard stepped forward with his most charming smile, the one he reserved for major clients and board presentations. "Elizabeth, it's an absolute pleasure to finally meet you in person," he said, taking her hand with both of his. "Sarah has told me so much about you and your family's remarkable company. I want you to know that we're deeply honored by your decision to entrust Zenith's future to Morrison Global." Elizabeth smiled politely, but I could see her evaluating Richard with the same careful attention she brought to all business relationships. She'd built a successful company by reading people accurately, and I wondered what she was seeing in Richard's carefully practiced charm. The introduction continued with David Chen, Jennifer Walsh, and finally Marcus Williams. I watched Elizabeth's expression carefully as Richard explained Marcus's role in the transaction, describing him as one of Morrison Global's most promising young executives and emphasizing his expertise in post-acquisition integration processes. "Marcus will be your primary point of contact going forward," Richard said, his hand resting on Marcus's shoulder in a gesture of paternal support. "He's been deeply involved in structuring the Zenith acquisition, and he'll be leading our integration efforts to ensure a smooth transition for your employees and operations." The lie was so smooth, so confidently delivered, that I almost admired Richard's audacity. Marcus hadn't been involved in structuring anything related to the Zenith acquisition. He'd been briefed on the deal's basic parameters less than 12 hours earlier. His expertise in post-acquisition integration consisted of academic coursework and one minor transaction he'd assisted with during his first year at Morrison Global. Elizabeth nodded politely, but I noticed that her gaze kept returning to me rather than focusing on Marcus. We'd spent 18 months building a relationship based on mutual trust and respect, and she clearly expected that I would continue to be her primary contact at Morrison Global. The idea that she would suddenly start working with a complete stranger, regardless of his qualifications, was contrary to everything we'd discussed about the post-acquisition management approach. We were escorted to Zenith's executive conference room, where the closing documents had been arranged on a polished mahogany table. The room overlooked the Thames, with views of London's historic financial district visible through floor-to-ceiling windows. It was an appropriate setting for a transaction that would reshape both companies' futures and establish Morrison Global as a dominant force in international logistics markets. The signing ceremony proceeded exactly as planned, with each party reviewing final documents, confirming wire transfer instructions, and executing the legal agreements that would transfer ownership of Zenith Industries. Elizabeth signed each document with careful attention to detail, occasionally asking Jennifer for clarification on specific contract provisions. Richard maintained his role as the visionary leader throughout the process, making casual conversation about Morrison Global's expansion plans and emphasizing the company's commitment to preserving Zenith's operational culture. His performance was flawless, projecting confidence and authority, while subtly positioning Marcus as the person Elizabeth should turn to for ongoing support and guidance. As the final documents were signed and the wire transfers initiated, Elizabeth stood to address the assembled group. "Today marks the end of one chapter and the beginning of another for Zenith Industries," she said, her voice carrying the weight of emotion that comes with transferring a family legacy. "My father built this company from nothing, and I've spent the past 15 years trying to honor his vision while adapting to changing market conditions." She paused, looking directly at me as she continued. "The decision to sell wasn't easy, but Sarah's commitment to preserving our company culture and protecting our employees made it possible. I want to thank everyone at Morrison Global for making this process as smooth as possible, but I especially want to thank Sarah for her patience, her insight, and her genuine care for what Zenith represents. The gratitude in Elizabeth's voice created a sharp pain in my chest. She was thanking me for facilitating a transaction that would ultimately benefit the company that had just fired me, expressing appreciation for care and commitment that had cost me my career. The irony was so bitter that I had to focus on maintaining my professional composure to avoid showing emotion. Richard stood to respond, delivering remarks that emphasized Morrison Global's excitement about the acquisition and its commitment to Zenith's continued success. He spoke about the synergies between the two companies, the growth opportunities that would emerge from their combination, and the bright future that lay ahead for all stakeholders. As Richard spoke, I noticed Elizabeth glancing at me with an expression I couldn't quite interpret. There was something in her eyes that suggested she was picking up on undercurrents in the room that others might miss. Elizabeth Caldwell hadn't built a successful company by ignoring her instincts about people and situations, and I wondered if she was sensing something about the dynamics between Richard, Marcus, and me. The closing ceremony concluded with handshakes, congratulations, and expressions of mutual respect and partnership. Wire transfers totaling $3.7 billion were initiated. Legal ownership documents were filed with appropriate regulatory authorities, and Zenith Industries officially became a subsidiary of Morrison Global Corporation. As we prepared to leave Zenith's headquarters, Elizabeth approached me privately, while Richard was occupied with final administrative details. "Sarah," she said quietly, "I wanted to thank you again for everything you've done to make this possible. I know it hasn't always been easy, dealing with all the regulatory requirements and financing complexities, but your professionalism has been exceptional throughout the process." I felt a knot forming in my stomach as Elizabeth continued. "I also wanted to ask about our conversation last month, regarding the post-acquisition integration approach. You mentioned that you'd be personally involved in managing the transition process, ensuring that our employee retention programs remain intact and our operational culture isn't disrupted by aggressive cost-cutting measures." The conversation she was referencing had taken place at her family estate, during a dinner where she'd expressed concerns about Morrison Global's reputation for prioritizing shareholder returns over employee welfare. I'd assured her that I would personally oversee the integration process, guaranteeing that Zenith's employees would be protected and the company's culture would be preserved. That conversation had been crucial to her decision to accept Morrison Global's offer over competing bids from private equity firms that had offered more money but couldn't provide the same assurances about preserving Zenith's operational independence. Elizabeth had chosen us because she trusted me personally, not because she believed in Richard Morrison's corporate vision. Now I was in the impossible position of maintaining that deception while knowing that I wouldn't be employed by Morrison Global after the weekend. Marcus Williams would be inheriting not just my client relationship with Elizabeth, but also the personal guarantees I'd made about post-acquisition management decisions. Guarantees that Richard had never authorized and Marcus had no knowledge of. "Yes," I said carefully, choosing my words with extreme caution. "The integration process will be managed very carefully to ensure continuity with your existing operations. Marcus is fully briefed on our commitment to maintaining Zenith's operational culture and employee retention programs." It wasn't technically a lie, but it wasn't the complete truth either. Marcus had been briefed on Morrison Global's general approach to post-acquisition integration, but he had no knowledge of the specific commitments I'd made to Elizabeth regarding employee protection and cultural preservation. More importantly, he had no understanding of how crucial these commitments had been to securing Elizabeth's agreement to the acquisition in the first place. Elizabeth nodded, but I could see that she wasn't entirely satisfied with my response. She was a perceptive businesswoman who'd learned to trust her instincts about people and situations. Something about the morning's proceedings had raised questions in her mind, though she was too polite to press for details during what should have been a celebratory moment. "We'll be in touch very soon about the integration timeline," she said, extending her hand for a final handshake. "I'm looking forward to working closely with you and your team to ensure this transition benefits everyone involved." The handshake felt like a goodbye, though Elizabeth had no way of knowing how accurate that impression was. In less than 72 hours, she would learn that the person she'd trusted to oversee Zenith's integration into Morrison Global was no longer employed by the company. She'd discover that the personal guarantees I'd made about employee protection and cultural preservation were commitments that Marcus Williams had never heard of, and Richard Morrison had never authorized. As we left Zenith's headquarters and returned to our cars, I found myself wondering how long it would take for the consequences of Richard's decision to become apparent. Elizabeth Caldwell was not the kind of person who would passively accept being deceived about something as fundamental as the continuity of her primary business relationship. The international banking partners who'd structured favorable financing terms based on their relationships with me were not going to be pleased to discover that their primary contact had been terminated 3 days after the deal closed. The regulatory authorities in 6 different countries who'd approved the acquisition based on Morrison Global's representations about management continuity were not going to appreciate learning that key personnel changes had been made immediately after receiving their approvals. The employees at both companies who'd been assured that the integration process would be managed by experienced professionals were not going to react well to discovering that their futures were now in the hands of someone with minimal relevant experience. Richard Morrison had made his decision to fire me based on cost considerations and his confidence that corporate relationships were transferable assets. He was about to discover that trust, credibility, and influence are personal currencies that can't be redistributed through organizational charts and executive memos. The celebration lunch was held at Rules, one of London's oldest restaurants and a favorite venue for Morrison Global's international business entertainment. Richard had reserved a private dining room where the deal team could toast the successful completion of the Zenith acquisition and discuss next steps for the integration process. The meal proceeded exactly as Richard had planned, with champagne toasts, congratulations all around, and detailed discussions of the operational synergies that would be realized through combining the two companies. Marcus Williams was positioned as the hero of the integration process, the young executive who would lead Morrison Global's expansion into new international markets. Throughout the lunch, I found myself observing the dynamics around the table with a strange sense of detachment. David Chen was clearly relieved that the complex financing arrangements had been executed successfully, knowing that any problems with the wire transfers or regulatory approvals would have fallen on his shoulders. Jennifer Walsh was satisfied that all legal requirements had been met, confident that Morrison Global was protected from any potential liability related to the acquisition. Richard Morrison was in his element, holding court with stories about previous acquisitions and painting a vision of Morrison Global's expanded presence in international logistics markets. He spoke about the company's bright future, the opportunities that would emerge from the Zenith acquisition, and his confidence in the next generation of executives who would drive continued growth. Marcus Williams listened attentively, asking thoughtful questions about integration strategies and market expansion opportunities. His enthusiasm was genuine, his questions demonstrated analytical thinking, and his confidence seemed to grow throughout the conversation. He was clearly excited about the opportunity to lead such a significant project, unaware of how unprepared he was for the challenges that lay ahead. As the lunch concluded and we prepared to return to the hotel, Richard pulled me aside for a private conversation. "Sarah," he said, his voice carrying the tone he used when he wanted something, "I want you to know how much I appreciate your professionalism today. I know this transition isn't easy, but your gracious handling of the situation demonstrates exactly why you've been so valuable to Morrison Global over the years." The compliment felt like salt in an open wound. Richard was praising my professionalism while simultaneously benefiting from my cooperation with my own dismissal. He wanted me to feel good about facilitating the transfer of my work to someone else, to take pride in making his cost-cutting decision look like a smooth corporate restructuring. "I also want to make sure you're completely comfortable with the knowledge transfer process," Richard continued. "Marcus is obviously very capable, but he'll need your insights to hit the ground running with the Zenith relationship. I'm hoping you can spend some time over the weekend, bringing him up to speed on any nuances he should be aware of." Richard's request was breathtaking in its casual assumption that I would spend my final weekend as a Morrison Global employee, training my replacement to take over relationships I'd spent years building. He wanted me to share the insights, strategies, and relationship management techniques that had made the Zenith acquisition possible, essentially providing Marcus with a roadmap for taking credit for my work. Under normal circumstances, professional courtesy and corporate loyalty might have motivated me to cooperate with Richard's request. I'd built my career on being helpful, on putting company interests ahead of personal considerations, on doing whatever was necessary to ensure successful outcomes for Morrison Global's clients and shareholders. But these weren't normal circumstances. Richard had terminated my employment while expecting me to facilitate the smooth transfer of my responsibilities to someone who'd had no involvement in creating them. He wanted me to prioritize Morrison Global's interests while he'd demonstrated complete indifference to mine. More importantly, Richard had made a fundamental miscalculation about the nature of the relationships underlying the Zenith acquisition. He assumed that client loyalty was a corporate asset that could be transferred through briefing sessions and introductory meetings. He failed to understand that Elizabeth Caldwell's trust in Morrison Global was actually trust in me personally, built through 18 months of consistent reliability, cultural sensitivity, and genuine care for her company's welfare. "Of course, Richard," I said, maintaining the polite professionalism that had served me throughout my career. "I'll make sure Marcus has everything he needs to manage the Zenith relationship effectively." It wasn't a lie, exactly. Marcus would indeed have everything he needed. It just wasn't going to be what Richard expected him to need. The young executive was about to discover that client relationship management involved more than understanding deal structures and integration strategies. He was about to learn that trust, once broken, was nearly impossible to rebuild, especially when clients felt deceived about fundamental aspects of their business relationships. As we returned to the hotel, I reflected on the strange position I found myself in. In less than 48 hours, I would no longer be employed by Morrison Global, but the consequences of the decisions made during my tenure would continue to unfold for months or even years. The Zenith acquisition would be my legacy at the company, the transaction that defined my contribution to Morrison Global's growth and established my reputation in international markets. Richard Morrison thought he could claim credit for that legacy while disposing of the person who'd created it. He was about to learn that some things can't be separated so cleanly, and that trust, once broken, has a way of creating consequences that extend far beyond severance packages and transition timelines. That evening, I sat in my hotel room reviewing the personal files I'd accumulated during 18 months of working on the Zenith acquisition. Correspondence with Elizabeth Caldwell that revealed her concerns about Morrison Global's employee policies, emails from international banking partners who'd structured favorable financing terms based on their relationships with me, regulatory approvals that had been secured through influence networks that existed in my professional sphere rather than Morrison Global's corporate database. The documents told the story of a complex transaction that had succeeded because of personal relationships, individual credibility and trust, that couldn't be transferred through organizational charts or executive briefings. Richard Morrison was about to discover that firing the architect of your success, especially immediately after that success is realized, can have consequences that extend far beyond the immediate cost savings. My phone buzzed with a text message from Elizabeth Caldwell, thanking me again for facilitating the successful completion of the acquisition and expressing her excitement about working with Morrison Global's team during the integration process. She mentioned looking forward to our follow-up meeting the following week, when we'd discuss the specific timeline for implementing the employee protection and cultural preservation measures we'd agreed upon. The message created a sharp pain in my chest, knowing that Elizabeth had no idea she'd been deceived about something as fundamental as the continuity of her primary business relationship. She'd chosen Morrison Global based on trust that no longer existed, made commitments based on relationships that were about to be severed, and structured her expectations around personal guarantees that Marcus Williams had never heard of. Tomorrow, Richard Morrison would return to New York, believing that he'd successfully completed the largest acquisition in Morrison Global's history, while simultaneously reducing personnel costs through strategic restructuring. He'd brief the board of directors on the successful closing, praise Marcus Williams for his contributions to the deal, and position himself as a visionary leader who'd identified and developed the next generation of executive talent. But Richard had made a fundamental error in his understanding of how international business relationships actually work. He'd assumed that trust was a corporate asset rather than a personal currency, that client loyalty could be transferred through introductory meetings and briefing sessions, that the relationships underlying the Zenith acquisition belonged to Morrison Global, rather than to the individual who'd created them. Within 72 hours, that error would begin to have consequences that extended far beyond his imagination. Elizabeth Caldwell would learn that she'd been deceived about the continuity of her primary business relationship. International banking partners would discover that their main contact had been terminated immediately after the deal closed. Regulatory authorities would realize that the personnel representations they'd relied upon in approving the acquisition were no longer accurate. The house of cards that Richard had unknowingly created by firing me 3 days after the Zenith closing was about to collapse, and I wouldn't have to do anything to make it happen. The consequences would unfold naturally, driven by the relationship dynamics and trust issues that Richard had never understood in the first place. As I prepared for bed, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Complete uncertainty about what would happen next, combined with absolute confidence that justice would ultimately prevail. Richard Morrison had made his choice, prioritizing short-term cost savings over long-term relationship management. Now he would discover that some decisions have consequences that extend far beyond their intended scope, and that trust, once broken, can create ripple effects that reshape entire companies' futures. Tomorrow would begin the process of unraveling everything Richard thought he'd accomplished, and I would watch it happen from the outside, knowing that sometimes the best revenge is simply allowing people to experience the natural consequences of their own poor decisions. The revelation hit me like lightning at 3 a.m. London time, jolting me awake in my hotel room with a clarity that cut through the fog of betrayal and anger I'd been carrying since Richard's announcement on the plane. I sat up in bed, my heart racing not from the shock of sudden awakening but from the realization of exactly how much power I actually held in this situation. Richard Morrison had made the fatal mistake that destroys most arrogant executives. He'd assumed he understood the full scope of what I brought to Morrison Global, when in reality, he'd only seen the surface. The Zenith acquisition wasn't just built on my relationships and expertise. It was structured around legal and financial mechanisms that existed entirely outside Morrison Global's corporate framework, mechanisms that I controlled personally, and that would cease to function the moment my employment ended. I reached for my laptop, my fingers moving with purpose as I accessed files that Richard had never seen, documents that existed in my personal cloud storage rather than Morrison Global's corporate servers. The true architecture of the Zenith deal was far more complex than Richard understood. Built on a foundation of personal guarantees, individual liability structures, and relationship-dependent financing arrangements that made me not just valuable to the transaction, but absolutely essential to its continued viability. The international banking consortium that had provided $3.7 billion in acquisition financing hadn't extended credit based on Morrison Global's corporate creditworthiness. They'd structured the loans around personal guarantees I'd provided, backed by relationships I'd cultivated over 15 years in international markets. Having a private investigator present would add weight to my evidence and prevent David and Mom from claiming I'd somehow fabricated everything. How much would that cost? For you, no charge. This case has piqued my professional interest and I'd like to see how it plays out. We shook hands on the arrangement and I left her office feeling more confident about Wednesday's plan. Everything was falling into place with the kind of precision that felt almost predetermined, like the universe was finally balancing accounts that had been overdue for too long. The weekend passed in a blur of domestic normalcy that felt increasingly surreal. David and I grocery shopped together, watched movies, made love with what seemed like genuine passion. He was either an extraordinary actor or had developed the ability to completely compartmentalize his double life. I found myself studying his face during quiet moments, looking for signs of guilt or conflict, but found nothing except the familiar features of the man I'd once trusted completely. Saturday evening, we had dinner with friends at their house, playing the role of the happy couple with practiced ease. David told charming stories about work, complimented my dress, held my hand during the car ride home. To any observer, we were the picture of marital contentment. "I love nights like this," he said as we got ready for bed. "Just being normal, you know. Sometimes I feel like we get so caught up in the day-to-day stress that we forget to just enjoy being together." The irony was so thick I could taste it, but I nodded and smiled and told him I felt the same way. We were both living in alternate realities now, mine built on knowledge and his on denial, but somehow we were still going through the motions of marriage like dancers following familiar choreography. Sunday brought the usual visit to Mom's house, but this time I went alone. David claimed he had work to catch up on, which I knew meant he was planning to visit her later when I wouldn't be there to witness their reunion. "You seem different lately," Mom said as we sat in her living room. The same room where I'd watched them embrace through hidden cameras just days before. Different how? Calmer, maybe? More settled. Like you figured something out that was bothering you. The observation was unsettling in its accuracy. I did feel calmer, more settled, now that I had a plan. Our conversations had gone far beyond standard client relationship management, evolving into a partnership based on shared values and mutual respect. Elizabeth had confided concerns about Richard's reputation that she'd never shared with anyone else at Morrison Global. She'd expressed reservations about typical corporate acquisition approaches that prioritized cost-cutting over cultural preservation. Most importantly, she'd made her final decision to accept our offer based on personal assurances I'd provided about my continued involvement in the integration process, assurances that Richard had never authorized and Marcus had no knowledge of. The dinner conversation at her family estate 6 weeks earlier had been the turning point in securing Elizabeth's agreement to the acquisition. She'd been leaning toward accepting a higher offer from Blackstone, concerned that Morrison Global's corporate culture wouldn't align with Zenith's values-driven approach to business. I'd convinced her to choose us by providing personal guarantees about employee protection, operational continuity, and cultural preservation measures that went far beyond what Richard would have approved if he'd known about them. Those guarantees weren't just casual promises. They were documented commitments that Elizabeth's legal team had incorporated into side agreements, binding obligations that Morrison Global would be required to honor regardless of personnel changes within the company. Marcus Williams was about to inherit responsibility for commitments he'd never heard of. Obligations that would require him to implement policies that might conflict with Richard's cost-cutting objectives. The integration timeline that Elizabeth expected was based on conversations I'd had with her about preserving Zenith's operational independence during the transition process. She believed that major structural changes would be phased in gradually over 18 months, with employee retention programs, cultural preservation measures, and operational continuity safeguards that I'd assured her would be implemented under my personal oversight. Richard's typical post-acquisition approach involved immediate cost reduction through workforce optimization, operational consolidation, and cultural integration designed to eliminate redundancies and maximize synergies. His standard timeline called for implementing major changes within 90 days of closing, exactly the opposite of what Elizabeth expected based on our previous conversations. The disconnect between Richard's intentions and Elizabeth's expectations wasn't just a communication problem. It was a fundamental breach of the relationship foundation that had made the acquisition possible in the first place. Elizabeth had chosen Morrison Global specifically because she believed I would personally ensure that her father's legacy would be preserved, that Zenith's employees would be protected, that the company's culture would remain intact during the transition process. Marcus Williams was walking into a situation where client expectations were completely misaligned with corporate objectives, where regulatory commitments required expertise he didn't possess, where financing arrangements depended on relationships he'd never developed. He would be expected to honor agreements he'd never seen, implement policies that hadn't been explained to him, and manage a post-acquisition process that was far more complex than Richard understood. I spent the next 2 hours reviewing every aspect of the Zenith acquisition, cataloging the relationship dependencies, personal guarantees, and individual commitments that made the transaction viable. The picture that emerged was both terrifying and liberating. Morrison Global's largest acquisition was built on a foundation that would collapse the moment my employment ended, and Richard had no understanding of how precarious his position actually was. The financing agreements would trigger automatic review within 30 days if key personnel changes occurred, potentially resulting in interest rate increases or accelerated repayment requirements. The regulatory approvals could be subject to renewed scrutiny if the government officials who'd granted them discovered that their primary contact was no longer involved in the integration process. Most critically, Elizabeth Caldwell's trust in Morrison Global would evaporate the moment she learned that I'd been terminated 3 days after the closing, potentially leading her to explore legal options for unwinding the transaction based on misrepresentation. Richard Morrison thought he'd successfully completed the largest acquisition in Morrison Global's history, while simultaneously reducing personnel costs through strategic restructuring. In reality, he'd created a cascading series of relationship failures that would begin unfolding within days of our return to New York. The carefully constructed framework that supported the Zenith acquisition would start crumbling the moment Elizabeth realized she'd been deceived about the continuity of her primary business relationship. But Richard's miscalculation went even deeper than the immediate threats to the Zenith transaction. My departure would signal to the broader international business community that Morrison Global was willing to sacrifice its most experienced relationship managers for short-term cost savings, calling into question the company's commitment to long-term client partnerships. The banking executives, regulatory officials, and corporate clients who'd worked with me over the years would notice my absence and draw their own conclusions about Morrison Global's priorities. The reputation damage would extend far beyond the Zenith acquisition, affecting Morrison Global's ability to compete for future deals in international markets. Corporate clients valued stability and continuity in their advisory relationships. They wanted to work with firms that rewarded experience and maintained consistent team structures. Richard's decision to fire me immediately after closing the company's largest transaction would send exactly the opposite message to potential clients. As dawn broke over London, I felt something I hadn't experienced since my early days in investment banking: the exhilarating combination of complete uncertainty and unlimited possibility. Richard Morrison had unknowingly freed me from the constraints of corporate employment, while simultaneously creating opportunities I never could have imagined as a Morrison Global executive. The relationships I'd built over 15 years in international markets belonged to me, not to Morrison Global. The reputation I'd established for successful deal execution, cultural sensitivity, and client advocacy existed independently of my corporate affiliation. The expertise I developed in navigating complex regulatory environments, structuring innovative financing arrangements, and managing post-acquisition integration processes was portable intellectual capital that I could leverage in any number of ways. Most importantly, the trust and respect I'd earned from clients like Elizabeth Caldwell represented a form of currency that couldn't be transferred to Marcus Williams or claimed by Richard Morrison. That trust had been built through consistent performance, personal integrity, and genuine care for client objectives over corporate profit maximization. It was mine to deploy however I chose, and Richard had just given me every reason to deploy it against Morrison Global's interests. I spent the morning walking through London's financial district, observing the familiar rhythms of international business, and reflecting on the irony of my situation. Just 24 hours earlier, I'd been Morrison Global's head of mergers and acquisitions, responsible for executing the company's largest transaction, while secretly planning my own professional destruction. Now I was a former employee with unprecedented leverage over my previous employer's future, holding relationships and knowledge that Richard desperately needed but could no longer access. The power shift was intoxicating, but it also required careful strategic thinking. I couldn't simply burn down Morrison Global's reputation in international markets that would damage the very relationships I hoped to leverage for my own benefit. Instead, I needed to allow the natural consequences of Richard's decisions to unfold, positioning myself as the solution to problems he didn't yet realize he'd created. Elizabeth Caldwell would discover the truth about my termination within days of our return to New York, when Marcus Williams attempted to schedule their first post-acquisition meeting, and she asked to speak with me instead. Her reaction would depend on how skillfully Marcus handled the situation, but given his inexperience and lack of relationship context, the conversation was likely to go poorly. The International Banking Consortium would learn about my departure when they attempted to schedule their routine post-closing meetings with Morrison Global's relationship managers. Their reaction would be more measured, reflecting the professional protocols of international finance, but their concern about continuity and relationship management would be genuine. The regulatory authorities would become aware of personnel changes through normal monitoring processes, but their response would depend on how well Marcus Williams managed the ongoing compliance requirements and relationship maintenance that I had handled personally. Each of these discoveries would create pressure points that Richard would need to address, relationship challenges that Marcus would struggle to manage, and reputation risks that Morrison Global couldn't afford to ignore. The cumulative effect would be a slow-motion crisis that threatened not just the Zenith acquisition, but Morrison Global's entire international business development strategy. My phone buzzed with a message from Richard, asking me to join the team for a farewell breakfast before our flight back to New York. The casual tone of his invitation, as if we were concluding a successful business trip rather than orchestrating my professional execution, demonstrated just how little he understood about the situation he'd created. I replied that I would meet them at the airport, claiming I had some personal business to handle before departure. The personal business was actually a series of phone calls I needed to make. Conversations that would begin laying the groundwork for what came next. The first call was to James Patterson, Managing Director at Deutsche Bank's London office and lead coordinator for the Zenith acquisition financing. James had been my primary banking relationship for 8 years, dating back to my first international deal as a junior executive. He trusted my judgment, respected my expertise, and had structured the Zenith financing specifically around his confidence in my ability to manage the post-acquisition process. James, I said when he answered, I wanted to give you a heads up about some personnel changes at Morrison Global that might affect our ongoing relationship management for the Zenith transaction. The conversation was carefully scripted to provide information without editorializing, to raise concerns without creating alarm. I explained that I'd been reassigned to new responsibilities that would reduce my involvement in post-acquisition relationship management, that Marcus Williams would be taking over as primary contact for ongoing banking coordination, and that there might be some adjustment period as the transition occurred. James's response was exactly what I'd expected. Professional concern about continuity, questions about Marcus's experience with international banking relationships, and subtle probing about whether the personnel changes reflected broader strategic shifts at Morrison Global. He didn't express alarm, but his tone conveyed the kind of careful attention that senior banking executives gave to situations that required monitoring. The second call was to Catherine Morrison, the European Union's Deputy Director for Competition Policy and the regulatory official who'd personally approved the Zenith acquisition, despite its potential impact on market concentration in the logistics sector. Catherine and I had worked together on 4 previous transactions, and she'd expedited the Zenith approval process based on her confidence in my representations about post-acquisition operational approaches. Catherine, I said, I wanted to make sure you were aware of some organizational changes at Morrison Global that might affect our ongoing coordination regarding the Zenith integration process. This conversation required even more delicate handling, since regulatory relationships were built on formal protocols and official representations rather than personal connections. I explained that reporting structures were being modified, that new personnel would be taking responsibility for regulatory compliance coordination, and that there might be requests for updated documentation as the transition occurred. Catherine's response reflected the bureaucratic caution that characterized regulatory officials. Acknowledgement of the information, questions about timeline for providing updated contact information, and subtle indication that continued monitoring of compliance commitments would be appropriate given the personnel changes. The third call was the most important and the most dangerous. Elizabeth Caldwell was expecting me to contact her within 48 hours to schedule our follow-up meeting about integration timeline and implementation of the employee protection measures we discussed. This conversation would determine whether the unraveling of Richard's position would be gradual and manageable or immediate and catastrophic. Elizabeth, I said when she answered, I wanted to follow up on our conversation yesterday about next steps for the integration process. The conversation required perfect pitch, providing information that would raise questions without creating immediate crisis, preparing her for revelations that would emerge naturally rather than forcing confrontations that could backfire. I explained that there had been some organizational restructuring at Morrison Global that would affect reporting relationships, that Marcus Williams would be taking on expanded responsibilities for post-acquisition coordination, and that she might want to clarify expectations and timelines directly with Richard Morrison's office. Elizabeth's response revealed the sharp business instincts that had made her successful. Immediate questions about the nature of the restructuring, concern about continuity in relationship management, and polite but pointed inquiry about whether the changes reflected broader strategic shifts that might affect Morrison Global's commitment to the agreements we'd negotiated. I assured her that Morrison Global remained committed to all aspects of the acquisition agreements, suggested that she schedule a direct conversation with Richard to discuss any concerns about implementation timelines, and emphasized that my primary objective was ensuring that Zenith's interests were protected throughout the transition process. The conversation ended with Elizabeth expressing appreciation for my continued attention to her concerns and indicating that she would indeed contact Richard's office to clarify expectations about ongoing relationship management. Her tone suggested that she'd picked up on undercurrents in our conversation, that she was preparing to ask harder questions than Richard was expecting to receive. By noon London time, I'd planted seeds that would grow into the problems Richard would face over the coming days. The banking relationships, regulatory connections, and client trust that supported the Zenith acquisition were all built on personal foundations that couldn't be transferred to Marcus Williams through briefing sessions and introductory meetings. The careful framework I'd constructed over 18 months was beginning to show cracks that would widen into structural failures, as the reality of my departure became apparent to key stakeholders. The flight back to New York was a masterpiece of cognitive dissonance, with Richard holding court about Morrison Global's successful expansion into international markets, while Marcus Williams asked earnest questions about relationship management strategies he'd never have the chance to implement effectively. David Chen reviewed financial projections that assumed continued favorable treatment from banking partners who'd never heard of him, while Jennifer Walsh organized legal documents that reflected regulatory commitments requiring expertise that Marcus didn't possess. Throughout the flight, I maintained the professional demeanor that had served me throughout my career, answering questions about client preferences and regulatory requirements, while knowing that the information I was sharing would be inadequate for the challenges that lay ahead. Richard had created a situation where failure was inevitable, where the relationship dependencies underlying Morrison Global's largest acquisition would become liabilities that threatened the company's entire international business strategy. As we approached JFK Airport, Richard pulled me aside for a private conversation. "Sarah," he said, his voice carrying the tone he used when he wanted to cement loyalty despite difficult circumstances, "I want you to know how much I appreciate your professionalism throughout this transition. Your gracious handling of the situation reflects exactly the kind of class that's made you so valuable to Morrison Global over the years." The compliment felt surreal coming from the man who'd just destroyed my career while expecting me to facilitate my own replacement. Richard wanted me to feel good about my cooperation with his cost-cutting decision, to take pride in making his organizational restructuring appear smooth and professional. "I'm also hoping," Richard continued, "that you'll be available for consultation during the first few weeks after Marcus takes over the Zenith relationship. There might be questions about relationship history or client preferences that would benefit from your institutional knowledge." Richard's request was breathtaking in its casual assumption that I would continue supporting Morrison Global's interests after being terminated, that professional courtesy would override personal dignity in service of the company's client relationships. He wanted me to provide ongoing consultation to help Marcus Williams succeed in the role I'd been fired from, essentially volunteering to make my own replacement more effective. The irony was perfect. Richard was asking me to help prevent the exact problems that his decision to fire me was about to create. He had no understanding that the relationship challenges Marcus would face weren't solvable through consultation calls or institutional knowledge transfers. Trust, once broken, couldn't be rebuilt through expertise sharing and strategic guidance. "Of course, Richard," I said, maintaining the polite professionalism that had defined our working relationship. "I want Morrison Global's client relationships to be successful, regardless of who's managing them." It wasn't a lie, exactly. I did want Morrison Global's client relationships to be successful. I just had a different definition of success than Richard did. True success in international business required trust, consistency, and long-term relationship commitment, values that Richard had demonstrated he didn't share by firing his most experienced relationship manager immediately after closing the company's largest transaction. As we gathered our luggage and prepared to clear customs, I reflected on the strange journey I'd taken over the past 48 hours. I'd traveled to London as Morrison Global's head of mergers and acquisitions, responsible for closing a $3.7 billion transaction that would define the company's future. I was returning as a former employee with unprecedented leverage over that same company's survival in international markets. Richard Morrison thought he'd successfully managed a difficult personnel decision, completing his largest acquisition while reducing costs through strategic restructuring. Marcus Williams believed he was inheriting a prestigious client relationship that would accelerate his career advancement. David Chen and Jennifer Walsh assumed that the Zenith transaction would proceed smoothly through the integration process, generating the financial returns and operational synergies that justified the acquisition premium. None of them understood that the carefully constructed framework supporting Morrison Global's international expansion was built on relationships and trust that couldn't be transferred through organizational charts and executive briefings. The foundation of their success was about to crumble, and they'd created that vulnerability through their own decisions rather than any external market forces. Within 72 hours, Elizabeth Caldwell would be asking questions that Marcus Williams couldn't answer effectively. International banking partners would be expressing concerns about relationship continuity that Richard couldn't address satisfactorily. Regulatory authorities would be requesting updated documentation that reflected expertise Morrison Global no longer possessed. The house of cards would collapse not through any action I took, but through the natural consequences of Richard's miscalculation about the transferability of trust and the nature of personal relationships in international business. He'd assumed he could dispose of the architect of his success while keeping the benefits of her work, failing to understand that some foundations can't be separated from the people who built them. As I walked through JFK Airport toward the taxi stand, I felt something I hadn't experienced since my first successful deal as a junior executive: the exhilarating combination of unlimited possibility and absolute confidence in my own abilities. Richard Morrison had unknowingly freed me from the constraints of corporate employment, while creating opportunities that I never could have imagined as his subordinate. The relationships I'd built, the reputation I'd earned, and the expertise I'd developed belonged to me, not to Morrison Global. Richard had just given me every reason to deploy those assets for my own benefit, rather than his company's continued success. The power shift was complete, and he had no idea what was about to hit him. Tomorrow would begin the process of discovering what happened when trust was broken, when relationships were taken for granted, and when the architect of your success decided she was tired of building other people's empires. Richard Morrison was about to learn that some decisions have consequences that extend far beyond their intended scope, and that respect, once lost, was nearly impossible to recover. The taxi pulled away from JFK as the Manhattan skyline came into view, and I knew that by the time the sun set on Monday, Richard Morrison's world would begin unraveling in ways he never could have anticipated. The best part was that I wouldn't have to do anything except watch the natural consequences of his own arrogance play out exactly as they inevitably would. Monday morning arrived with the precision of a Swiss timepiece, and with it, the beginning of Richard Morrison's education in the true cost of betraying irreplaceable talent. I sat in my apartment, coffee in hand, watching the sunrise paint Manhattan's skyline, while knowing that 40 floors below me in Morrison Global's headquarters, Marcus Williams was about to face the first real test of his ability to manage relationships he'd never built. Elizabeth Caldwell's call came at exactly 9:15, her voice carrying the crisp professionalism that masked growing concern. She'd scheduled a conference call with Morrison Global's senior team to discuss the integration timeline, and she wanted clarification on several points that had emerged since our London meeting. The conversation was surgical in its precision. Elizabeth asked pointed questions about personnel continuity, regulatory compliance oversight, and the specific implementation schedule for the employee protection measures we'd negotiated. Her inquiries weren't accusations, but they revealed a sophisticated understanding of the gaps between what she'd been promised and what Morrison Global was actually prepared to deliver. Marcus Williams struggled through the call with the desperation of someone trying to appear competent in a subject he'd learned about 3 days earlier. His answers were technically accurate, but lacked the relationship context that made them meaningful. When Elizabeth asked about the timeline for implementing the cultural preservation initiatives, Marcus referenced standard post-acquisition protocols that bore no resemblance to the customized approach we'd developed specifically for Zenith's unique situation. The fatal moment came when Elizabeth asked to speak with me directly about coordinating the regulatory compliance documentation that several government agencies were requesting. Marcus hesitated, clearly unprepared for this specific request, before explaining that I'd been reassigned to other priorities within Morrison Global and wouldn't be available for ongoing client coordination. The silence that followed lasted exactly 7 seconds, but it contained the sound of trust evaporating in real time. Elizabeth's response was measured but devastating. She expressed surprise that such a significant personnel change had occurred without notification. particularly given the commitments that had been made about continuity and relationship management. Richard Morrison tried to salvage the situation by positioning my reassignment as a promotion that reflected Morrison Global's confidence in developing new talent. But his explanation only deepened Elizabeth's concerns. She'd spent 18 months building a relationship with me specifically because she needed assurance that Zenith's interests would be protected by someone she trusted personally. The call ended with Elizabeth requesting a face-to-face meeting with Richard by Wednesday to discuss her concerns about the integration approach and timeline. Her tone was diplomatic but firm, carrying the unmistakable message that Morrison Global's credibility with Zenith's leadership was now in serious question. By noon, the International Banking Consortium was asking similar questions. James Patterson from Deutsche Bank contacted Morrison Global directly, requesting an updated organizational chart and clarification about ongoing relationship management for the Zenith financing facilities. The banking agreements included specific provisions about personnel continuity, and my departure triggered automatic reviews of credit terms and relationship oversight requirements. Marcus Williams found himself fielding calls from banking executives he'd never met, attempting to discuss financing arrangements he didn't fully understand, while assuring international partners that Morrison Global remained committed to all aspects of the lending relationships. His inexperience wasn't just obvious, it was dangerous in a context where banking relationships depended on demonstrated expertise and established credibility. The regulatory challenges emerged more slowly, but with potentially more serious consequences. The European Union's Competition Directorate requested updated documentation about Morrison Global's post-acquisition management approach, specifically asking for confirmation that the personnel representations made during the approval process remained accurate. Similar inquiries came from regulatory authorities in Canada, Australia, and 3 other jurisdictions, where approval had been granted based on my direct involvement in compliance oversight. Marcus Williams was now responsible for managing regulatory relationships in 6 different countries, maintaining compliance with approval conditions he'd never seen, and satisfying documentation requirements that reflected expertise he didn't possess. Each regulatory inquiry created new pressures for Morrison Global, new deadlines that had to be met, new opportunities for mistakes that could jeopardize the entire acquisition. The media attention began on Tuesday morning with a brief item in the Financial Times noting unusual trading activity in Morrison Global's stock price. The article mentioned concerns about management continuity related to the Zenith acquisition, citing anonymous sources familiar with the transaction. By afternoon, industry publications were reporting that key personnel changes at Morrison Global had raised questions about the company's commitment to major client relationships. Richard Morrison spent Tuesday in crisis management mode, fielding calls from board members, reassuring major shareholders, and attempting to control a narrative that was rapidly spinning beyond his influence. The stock price dropped 11% in 2 days, reflecting market concerns about Morrison Global's ability to maintain the relationships that supported its international expansion strategy. The cascade accelerated on Wednesday when Elizabeth Caldwell arrived at Morrison Global's headquarters for her meeting with Richard. She brought her legal team and a list of specific questions about compliance with the agreements that had made the acquisition possible. Her concerns weren't just about personnel changes, they were about fundamental misrepresentations regarding Morrison Global's commitment to the relationship management and operational continuity that had been central to her decision to sell. The meeting lasted 4 hours and ended with Elizabeth's legal team requesting comprehensive documentation about Morrison Global's post-acquisition compliance capabilities. Her message was clear. If Morrison Global couldn't demonstrate that it could honor the specific commitments that had secured the acquisition, Zenith's board would consider all available legal remedies, including potential action to unwind the transaction based on material misrepresentation. By Thursday morning, the International Banking Consortium was demanding immediate meetings with Morrison Global's senior management. The financing agreements included specific provisions that allowed lenders to review credit terms if key personnel changes affected the borrower's operational capabilities. Marcus Williams's obvious inexperience with international banking relationships had raised red flags throughout the consortium, creating concerns about Morrison Global's ability to manage the post-acquisition integration process effectively. The regulatory authorities were asking harder questions about compliance oversight and documentation management. The approvals they'd granted were based on specific representations about Morrison Global's expertise and continuity. Representations that no longer appeared accurate given the personnel changes that had occurred immediately after closing. Richard Morrison's carefully constructed acquisition was unraveling exactly as I'd known it would, not because of any action I'd taken, but because of the natural consequences of his own miscalculations about the nature of trust and relationship management in international business. Friday brought the call I'd been expecting since Monday morning. Richard's number appeared on my phone at exactly 10:30, and his voice carried a desperation I'd never heard before. "Sarah, we need to talk immediately. There are some complications with the Zenith situation that require your expertise." The conversation that followed was a masterpiece of corporate desperation disguised as professional consultation. Richard explained that Elizabeth Caldwell had raised concerns about continuity and relationship management, that the banking consortium was requesting additional documentation about operational capabilities, that regulatory authorities were asking questions about compliance oversight that Marcus was struggling to address effectively. He wanted me to return to Morrison Global immediately, not as an employee but as a consultant, to help resolve the relationship challenges that were threatening the entire Zenith acquisition. He offered consulting fees that exceeded my previous salary, stock options that would vest immediately, and assurances that my departure had been a strategic mistake that he was prepared to correct. The irony was breathtaking. Richard was asking me to save him from the consequences of his own decision to fire me, offering compensation packages that demonstrated exactly how valuable I'd been to Morrison Global's success. He wanted me to repair relationships he'd damaged, restore trust he'd broken, and prevent the collapse of an acquisition he'd jeopardized through his own arrogance. My response was brief and final. "Richard, I appreciate the opportunity, but I'm pursuing other interests that don't involve Morrison Global." The silence that followed contained the sound of Richard Morrison realizing that some consequences can't be bought, that some trust can't be restored, and that some decisions create problems that money and desperation can't solve. Monday brought news that Elizabeth Caldwell had initiated legal proceedings against Morrison Global for material misrepresentation in connection with the Zenith acquisition. Her complaint alleged that Morrison Global had made specific commitments about personnel continuity and relationship management that it had no intention of honoring, commitments that were material to her decision to accept the acquisition offer. The International Banking Consortium announced that it was reviewing credit terms and relationship management requirements for all Morrison Global facilities, citing concerns about operational capabilities and continuity. Several consortium members indicated that they might require additional collateral or accelerated repayment schedules pending resolution of the relationship management issues. Regulatory authorities in 3 jurisdictions opened formal reviews of their acquisition approvals, citing personnel changes that raised questions about Morrison Global's ability to satisfy the conditions that had secured regulatory clearance. Morrison Global's stock price collapsed, falling 37% in 5 trading days, as investors realized that the company's largest acquisition was built on a foundation that was crumbling rapidly. Richard Morrison faced calls for his resignation from board members, who'd supported his cost-cutting initiatives, until they understood the true cost of his penny-wise, pound-foolish decision-making. The final irony came 2 weeks later when I received a call from Elizabeth Caldwell. She'd learned about my departure from Morrison Global through her legal team's investigation, and she wanted to discuss the possibility of working together directly. Her family trust was considering unwinding the Morrison Global acquisition and pursuing alternative arrangements that would preserve Zenith's operational independence while still achieving the strategic objectives that had motivated the original sale. 6 months later, I was running my own international advisory firm, with Elizabeth Caldwell as my founding client, and several former Morrison Global clients who'd followed me when they learned about my departure. The relationships I'd built, the reputation I'd earned, and the expertise I'd developed weren't corporate assets. They were personal currency that I could deploy however I chose. Richard Morrison's attempt to replace irreplaceable talent with cheaper alternatives had cost his company its largest acquisition, its credibility in international markets, and ultimately his own position as chief executive officer. The board of directors who'd supported his restructuring decisions removed him 6 months after the Zenith acquisition collapsed, citing strategic leadership failures that had damaged shareholder value and corporate reputation. Marcus Williams left Morrison Global 3 months after my departure, recognizing that he'd been set up for failure in a role that required experience and relationships he didn't possess. He found a position at a smaller firm where his analytical capabilities could be developed properly, without the pressure of managing relationships that were beyond his current expertise level. The lessons were simple but profound. Trust can't be transferred, relationships can't be redistributed, and respect, once lost, is nearly impossible to recover. Richard Morrison had learned these lessons the hard way, discovering that some decisions have consequences that extend far beyond their intended scope. As I sat in my new office overlooking Manhattan's skyline, I reflected on the journey from Morrison Global's corporate hierarchy to entrepreneurial independence. Richard had thought he could dispose of the architect of his success while keeping the benefits of her work. Instead, he'd created the opportunity for me to build something better, something mine, something that valued relationships over cost-cutting and trust over short-term profit maximization. The best revenge, I'd learned, wasn't plotting the destruction of those who'd betrayed me. It was simply allowing them to experience the natural consequences of their own poor decisions. While building something better from the foundation they'd helped me discover, I didn't need them to succeed. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.